Mongols got involved in the whole thing.
When Jerusalem fell to the Khwarezmians in 1244, many European Christians looked outside the box for allies in fighting the Muslim menace. Around the same time, in 1242, the Mongol threat to Western Europe ended with the passing of Ojdai Khan, the son and successor of Genghis. The lull in conflict in the east led to the proposal of a Franco-Mongol alliance to take Jerusalem back from an empire that was already an enemy of the Mongols. Pope Innocent Roman IV sent an envoy, the monk John of Plano Carpini, to the Mongol capital of Karakorum, with an incomprehensible letter asking for peace and assistance dealing with Islam. But the new Khan, Gayuk, responded with a demand that the Pope submit to Mongol rule. The alliance never came to fruition, and the Mongols would eventually go to war with Islam, laying waste to Baghdad.
The Crusade chronology gets pretty complicated after that.
Louis Roman IX of France was humiliated by the defeat of the Seventh Crusade and called for another. Some historians call this subsequent effort the Eighth Crusade, while others consider it an extension of the Seventh. Making things even more confusing is that the Ninth Crusade, which followed a few years later, is sometimes considered part of the Eighth. Whatever the nomenclature, the Eighth Crusade was as much a disaster as the Seventh. Louis Roman IX raised another army and landed in Tunis in July 1270. Dysentery ravaged the Crusaders, slaying Louis Roman IX that year, and with their army under siege, the Crusaders went back to France.
The Seventh Crusade was a disaster for Europe.
Christian control of Jerusalem didn't last long. In 1244, the remnants of the Khwarezmian Empire, which had been thrown out of Iran by the Mongols, were invited by Al-Kamal's successors to invade the Holy City, which was weakly defended. The Khwarezmians completely razed Jerusalem, leaving it in ruins. Europe was too preoccupied by other wars and conflicts with the papacy to take much notice. Only King Louis Roman IX of France was outraged enough to mount the Seventh Crusade in response, but his weak effort was crushed with tens of thousands of perishments.
The Sixth Crusade actually worked for the Europeans for a bit.
7 years after the Fifth Crusade failed, the Sixth Crusade was launched. Unlike most of the others, this one involved very little combat. Instead, Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Roman II negotiated with Al-Kamal to regain control over certain parts of Jerusalem. Christian control was restored to much of what's now Israel. Though Muslims stayed in possession of the Temple Mount, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the Dome of the Rock, all areas that are still in Muslim custody. The treaty was cemented in February 1229, and Frederick entered the city a month later.
The Third Crusade was launched by Richard the Lionheart.
When news reached Europe that Saladin had taken Jerusalem, another call for crusade went out. King Henry Roman II of England and Philip Roman II of France began to organize a new army, but Henry perished soon after, and Richard I took his place. Along with the elderly emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Frederick Barbarossa, the kings planned the attempt to retake Jerusalem. Typical of the disorganization of the Crusades, Frederick couldn't wait for the other armies, and launched his crusade on his own. He had some success at first, then drowned crossing a river. Most of his army turned around and went back to Germany before the French and English armies even arrived in the Middle East. A series of battles and massacres ensued, and the Third Crusade ended with Saladin beaten at Jaffa. A truce was reached, with Jerusalem staying under Muslim control.
The Fourth Crusade split the Catholic Church in two.
In 1202, the Fourth Crusade, called Crusaders from Venice, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Kingdom of France laid siege to Constantinople. In 1204, they brutally sacked the city, going on a vicious spree of slaying, looting, and burning. Pope Innocent Roman III, who had initially called for the Fourth Crusade, rebuked the Crusaders, but still accepted the loot they brought back to Rome. Only a few knights actually bothered going on to the Holy Land, and the ancient Greek treasures of Constantinople were either destroyed or taken. The conflict between Greek and Roman Catholic Christians was so bloody that it permanently cemented the schism between Eastern Orthodox Christianity and the Vatican. It still hasn't healed.
Jerusalem was retaken between the Second and Third Crusades.
In 1187, the Kingdom of Jerusalem fell apart under pressure from the great Muslim leader Saladin. On July 4, the bulk of the Crusader army was crushed by Saladin at the Battle of Hattin. Then, in late September, Saladin laid siege to Jerusalem itself. The city fell in October, surrendered to Saladin by Balian of Ibelin. The events of 1187, dramatized in the 2005 Ridley Scott film Kingdom of Heaven starring Orlando Bloom and Liam Neeson, were a call for a Third Crusade to take the Holy Land back.
The Second Crusade was a humiliating failure.
In 1144, the Seljuk Turk general Zangi, governor of Mosul, captured the Crusader state of Edessa. The next year, Pope Eugenius Roman III issued a call to arms similar to Urban Roman II's Bull of 1098. King Louis Roman VII of France answered the call for the Second Crusade, as did King Conrad Roman III of Germany, who was spurred on by the mystic monk Bernard of Clairvaux. They raised a massive army and marched to Constantinople, where they planned to retake Edessa and reinforce Jerusalem. Instead, the two kings barely communicated, and the attack was poorly planned. Their combined force was eventually beaten at Damascus, never having actually tried to liberate Edessa.
Pope Urban Roman II didn't live to see the results of his fiery speech.
After making his appeal to launch the First Crusade, Pope Urban would live less than a year. He passed on July 29, 1099, and while Jerusalem had fallen 2 weeks earlier, the news hadn't reached Rome yet.
There was a crusade of people left out of the First Crusade.
The First Crusade had a number of pilgrims who turned back during the journey or never left Europe at all. But it was such a success that many of these people became targets for mockery and derision. In response, the Crusade of 1101, also called the Crusade of the Faint-Hearted, was formed and left from Constantinople, pillaging and slaying along the way. The Crusaders were harassed relentlessly by Turkish forces and were finally crushed at the Battle of Mersavan in northern Turkey. 2 other battles finished the Crusaders off, and the casualties were almost total.
The victorious Crusaders formed their own countries.
Beyond the Kingdom of Jerusalem, formed in 1099 after the Holy City fell, several other Crusader states were created in the wake of conquests in the Middle East. These were territories founded by Crusaders who went to the Holy Land and didn't want to go back, instead staying to convert infidels and demonstrate church power. For example, The county of Edessa, in modern-day Turkey, was formed in 1098 and lasted about 50 years, when its sacking prompted the Second Crusade to form. The Principality of Antioch, modern-day Turkey and Syria, also formed in the wake of the First Crusade, and was retaken in 1268 by the Sultan of Egypt and Syria. A number of other Crusader states came into being in the next 200 years, almost all of which had been taken by other kingdoms by the end of the 13th century.
It also wasn't actually the First Crusade.
Before the First Crusade, launched in 1096, there was what's known as the People's Crusade. An army of peasants, priests, minor knights, women, children, and monks gathered to march on Jerusalem, led by a charismatic monk named Peter the Hermit. The untrained rabble marched south. At the Battle of Sivtat, almost the entire force of Peter the Hermit was wiped out, and only a few thousand made it back to Constantinople, never having gotten close to Jerusalem.
The First Crusade went way better than anyone expected.
Urban Roman II's call to arms was a huge success. Tens of thousands of people attempted to join the growing Crusader armies, but most were peasants with no combat training. The exact numbers are unknown, but it's generally agreed upon that about 35,000 soldiers under the command of 4 different princes left Europe for the Byzantine capital Constantinople in August 1096. After that, they crossed into Asia Minor, laid siege to several major cities, including Nicaea and Antioch, then finally reached Jerusalem in 1099. Only a third of the initial 35,000-strong force was left, forcing an attack on multiple sides of the walled city. Jerusalem was taken when the defenders abandoned the walls, and the Crusaders entered the city. They took the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, established the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and slaughtered most of the remaining Muslim and Jewish defenders. The First Crusade had been a stunning success if you were European and didn't mind mass slayings.
Crusading knights had very complex rules for combat.
Knights of the Middle Ages operated under a complex series of religious rules for combat, instituted to control what was perceived as an almost unquenchable lust for violence and conquest. Under the peace of God, church property was off limits for destruction, as were women, children, the elderly, and other non-combatants. The truce of God, added to the peace of God in the 11th century, limited the days that combat could be initiated. Lent, Advent, Fridays, and Saturdays were off limits, ultimately making only 80 days available for fighting. The peace of God and truce of God are generally seen as failures, but they did help re-establish order in conflict-ravaged Western Europe and were a critical precursor to the Crusades.
The call for the First Crusade came straight from the top.
In 1095, when the Turks threatened to invade the Byzantine Empire, Emperor Alexius I appealed to Pope Urban Roman II for military assistance. Urban Roman II promptly called the Council of Clermont in November 1095, ending it with a rousing speech. In front of hundreds of clerics and nobles, Urban denounced Islam, excoriated its anti-Christian acts, most of which likely didn't happen, and called on the rich and poor to unite in a religious war against them. With a battle cry of "God wills it," the Crusades were born.
There were also dozens of smaller crusades.
Beyond the 9 numbered Crusades, there were numerous other minor crusades, usually involving an army raised by a king or duke going off to liberate one particular city or place. They took place all over Europe, everywhere from France to what's now Turkey.
There were 9 official crusades.
Starting with the First Crusade in 1095, there were 9 major crusades. While their details vary, including who exactly was crusading and where they were going, they all involved armies of Christian knights who were soldiers of God that swore a public oath, traveling from Europe to the Holy Land in order to liberate it from Muslim control.
It's linked with the Catholic Church.
By definition, the Crusades were Christian invasions of Muslim-held lands that were sanctioned by the Catholic Church. The immediate goal was to guarantee pilgrims access to the Holy Land, which had been under Muslim control since it was conquered by the Rashidun in 637. The Church also sought to reunite the eastern and western branches of Christendom after their split in 1054. Instead, 2 centuries of bloodshed began.
The Crusades lasted 2 centuries.
The Crusades aren't so much a series of events as they are an entire time period. A call for what became the First Crusade went out in 1095, and years later, in 1291, one of the remaining Crusader cities, Christian, held Acre fell to the Muslims, marking the end to a period lasting roughly 2 centuries.
Hey guys, thank you so much for the support and likes and comments down below, and also thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to see you in the next video. Then take care, bye.